Chapter 7. Experimental Torture. Great is the change when we turn from the easy, thoughtless indifferentism of the sportsman or the milliner to the more determined and deliberately chosen attitude of the scientist. So great indeed that by many people, even among professed champions of animals' rights, it is held impossible to trace such dissimilar lines of action to one and the same source. Yet it can be shown, I think, that in this instance, as in those already examined, the prime cause of man's injustice to the lower animals is the belief that they were mere automata, devoid alike of spirit, character and individuality. Only while the ignorant sportsman expresses this contempt through the medium of Batu, the milliner through that of the bonnet, the more seriously minded psychologist works his work in the experimental torture of the laboratory. The difference lies in the temperament of the men and in the tone of their profession, but in their denial of the most elementary rights of the lower races. They are all inspired and instigated by one common prejudice. The analytical method employed by modern science tends ultimately, in the hands of most of its enlightened exponents, to the recognition of a close relationship between mankind and the animals, but incidentally it has exercised a most sinister effect on the study of just animalium among the mass of average men, for consider the dealings of the so-called naturalist with the animals, whose nature he makes it his business to observe. In 99 cases out of 100, he is wholly unappreciative of the essential distinctive quality, the individuality, of the subject of his investigations, and becomes nothing more than a contented accumulator of facts, an industrious dissector of carcasses. I think the most important requisite in describing an animal, says Thoreau, is to be sure that you give its character and spirit, for in that you have, without error, the sum and the effect of all its parts known and unknown. Surely the most important part of an animal is its anima, its vital spirit, of which it's based its character, and all the particulars by which it most concerns us. Yet most scientific books which treat of animals leave this out altogether, and what they describe are, as it were, phenomena of dead matter. The whole system of our natural history, as practiced at the present time, is based on this deplorably partial and misleading method. Does a rare bird alight on our shores, it is at once slaughtered by some enterprising collector and proudly handed over to the nearest taxidermist, that it may be preserved among a number of other stuffed corpses in a local museum. It is dismal business at best, this science of the fowling piece and the dissecting knife, but it is in keeping with the materialistic tendency of a certain school of thought, and only a few of its professors rise out of it and above it. To a maturer and far more sighted understanding, the child, says Michelet, disports himself, shatters and destroys. He finds his happiness in undoing, and science in his childhood does the same. It cannot study unless it kills. The sole use which makes of a living mind is, in the first place, to dissect it. None carry into scientific pursuits that tender reverence of life which nature rewards by unveiling to us her mysteries. Under these circumstances, it is scarcely to be wondered at that modern scientists, their minds athirst for further and further opportunities of satisfying this analytical curiosity, should desire to have recourse to the experimental torture which is euphemistically described as vivisection. They are caught and impelled by the overmastering passion of knowledge, and as a handy subject for the gratification of this passion, they see before them the helpless race of animals, in part wild, in part domesticated, but alike regarded by the generality of mankind as incapable of possessing any rights. They are practically accustomed, despite their ostensible disavowal of the Cartesian theory, to treat these animals as automata, things made to be killed and dissected and catalogued for the advancement of knowledge. They are, moreover, in their professional capacity, the lineal descendants of a class of men who, however kindly and considerate in other respects, have never sculpted the subordinate and strongest promptings of humaneness in the least the supposed interests of science. Given these conditions, it seems as inevitable the psychologist should vivisect as the country gentleman should shoot. Experimental torture is an appropriately the study of the half-enlightened man, as sport is the amusement of the half-witted. For the fact that vivisection is not, as some of its opponents would appear to regard it, a portentous, unaccountable phenomenon, but rather the logical outcome of a certain ill-balanced habit of mind, does not in any way detract from its intellectual and moral loathsomeness. It is idle to spend a single moment in advocating the rights of the lower animals, if such rights do not include a total and unqualified exemption from the awful tortures of vivisection. from the doom of being slowly and mercilessly dismembered or flayed or baked alive or infected with some deadly virus or subjected to any of the numerous modes of torture inflicted by the scientific inquisition. Let us heartily endorse the words of Miss Cobb on this crucial subject, that the minimum of all possible rights plainly is to be spared the worst of all possible wrongs, and if a horse or a dog have no claim to be spared from being maddened and mangled after the fashion of Pasteur de Chavaux, then it is impossible to have any right at all, or that any offence against it, by gentle or simple, can deserve punishment. It is necessary to speak strongly and unmistakably on this point, because, as I have already said, there is a disposition on the part of some of the friends of animals to palter and compromise with vivisection, as if the alleged utility of its practices, or the conscientious motives of its professors, put it on an altogether different footing from other kinds of inhumanity. Much against my own feelings, wrote one of these backsliders, I do see a warrant for vivisection in the case of harmful animals, and animals which are man's rivals for food. If an animal is doomed to be killed on other grounds, the vivisector, when its time comes, may step in, buy it, kill it in his own way, and take without self-reproach the gain to knowledge which he can get from its death. And my sweetest life theory would further allow animals being specially bred for vivisection, where only they would otherwise not have been bred at all. This astounding argument, which assumes the necessity of vivisection, gives away, it will be observed, the whole case of animal rights. The assertion, commonly made by the apologists of the scientific inquisition, that vivisection is justified by its utility, that it is, in fact, indispensable to the advance of knowledge and civilization, is founded on a mere half view of the position. The scientist, as I have already remarked, is a half enlightened man. Let us assume, a large assumption certainly, controverted as it is by some most weighty medical testimony, that the progress of surgical science is assisted by the experiments of the vivisector. What then? Before rushing to the conclusion that vivisection is justifiable on that account, a wise man will take into full consideration the other, more moral side of the question, the hideous injustice of torturing an innocent animal, and the terrible wrong thereby done to the human sense of the community. A wise scientist and the wise humanist are identical. A true science cannot possibly ignore the solid, incontrovertible fact. The practice of vivisection is revolting to human conscience, even among the ordinary members of a not over-sensitive society. The so-called science, we are compelled unfortunately in common parlance to use the word in this specialised technical meaning, which deliberately overlooks this fact and confines its view to the material aspects of the problem, is not science at all, but a one-sided assertion of the views which find favour with a particular class of men. Nothing is necessary which is abhorrent, revolting, intolerable to the general instincts of humanity. Better 1,000 times that science should forego or postpone the questionable advantage of certain problematic discoveries than that a moral conscience of the community should be unmistakably outraged by the confusion of right and wrong. The shortcut is not always the right path, and to perpetuate a cruel injustice on the lower animals and then attempt to excuse it on the ground that it will benefit posterity is an argument which is as irrelevant as it is immoral. Ingenious it may be in the way of hoodwinking the unwary, but it is certainly in no true sense scientific. If there be one bright spot, one refreshing oasis in the discussion of this dreary subject, it is the numerous reoccurrence of the old threadbare fallacy of better for the animals themselves. Yes, even here in the laboratory of the vivisector, amidst the baking and sawing and dissection, we are sometimes met by that familiar friend, the proud plea of the single-hearted regard for the interest of the suffering animals. Who knows but what some beneficent experimentalist, if only he permitted to cut up a sufficient number of victims, may discover some potent remedy for all the lamented ills of the animal as well as the human creation? Can we doubt that the victims themselves, if once they could realise the noble object of their martyrdom, would vie with each other in rushing eagerly under the knife? The only marvel is that, where the cause is so meritorious, no human volunteer has yet to come forward to die under the hands of a vivisector. It is fully admitted that experiments on men would be far more valuable and conclusive than experiments on animals, yet scientists usually disavow any wish to revive these practices and indigently deny the rumours occasionally circulated that the poorer patients in hospitals are the subjects of such animatical curiosity. Now here it will be observed, in the case of men, the moral aspect of vivisection is admitted by the scientists as a matter of course, yet in the case of animals it is allowed no weight whatever. How can this strange inconsistency be justified unless on the assumption that men have rights, but animals have no rights. In other words, that animals are mere things, possessed of no purpose and no claim on the justice and forbearance of the community. One of the most notable and ominous features in the apologies offered for vivisection is the assertion, so commonly made by scientific writers, that it is no worse than certain kindred practices. When the upholders of any accused institution begin to plead that it is no worse than other institutions, we may feel quite as assured that the case is a very bad one indeed. It is the drowning man catching at the last straw and shred of one argument. Thus the advocates of experimental torture are reduced to the expedient of laying stress on the cruelties of the butcher and the herdsman, and inquiring why, if poleaxing and castration are permissible, vivisection may not also be permitted. Sport also is a practice which has greatly shocked the susceptibilities of the humane vivisector. A writer in the Fortnightly Review has defined sport as the love of the clever destruction of clever things, and has calculated the 3 millions of animals yearly mangled by English sportsmen, in addition to those killed outright. Now, if the attack on vivisection emanated primarily and wholly from the apologists of the sportsman or the slaughterer, this tu quoque of the scientists must be allowed to be a smart, though rather flippant retort. But when all cruelty is arraigned as inhuman and unjustifiable, an evasive answer of this kind ceases to have any relevancy or pertinence. Let us admit, however, that in contrast with the childish brutality of the sportsman, the undoubted seriousness and conscientiousness of the vivisector, for I do not question that he acts from conscientious motives, may be counted to his advantage. But then we have to remember, on the other hand, that the conscientious man, when he goes wrong, is far more dangerous to society than knave or the fool. Indeed, the special horror of vivisection consists precisely in this fact, that it is not due to mere thoughtlessness and ignorance, but represents a deliberate, avowed, conscientious invasion of the very principle of animals' rights. I have already said that it is idle to speculate which is the worst form of cruelty to animals, for certainly in this subject, if anywhere, we must reject the law of nicely calculated less or more. Vivisection, if there is any truth at all in the principle from which I am contending, is not the root, but the fine flower of consummation of barbarity and injustice, the ne plus ultra of iniquity in man's dealings with the lower races. The root of evil lies, as I have throughout asserted, in that detestable assumption, detestable equally whether it is based on pseudo-religious or pseudo-scientific grounds, that there is a gulf, an impassable barrier between man and the animals, and that the moral instincts of compassion, justice and love are to be as sedulously repressed and thwarted in one direction as they to be fostered and extended in another. For this very reason, our crusade against the scientific inquisition, to be thorough and successful, must be founded on the rock of the consistent opposition to cruelty in every form and phase. It is useless to denounce vivisection as the source of all inhumanities, and while demanding its immediate suppression, to suppose that the other minor questions may be indefinitely postponed. It is true that the actual emancipation of the lower races, as of the human, can only proceed step by step, and that it is both natural and politic to strike first at what is the most repulsive to the public conscience. I am not depreciating the wisdom of such a concentration of effort on any particular point, but warning my readers against the too common tendency to forget the general principle that underlies each individual protest. The spirit in which we approach these matters should be a liberal and far-seeing one. Those who work for the abolition of vivisection, or any other particular wrong, should do so with the avowed purpose of capturing one stronghold of the enemy, not because they believe that the war will then be over, but because then they will be able to use the position thus gained as an advantageous starting point for still further progression.